Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. We have finally made it to World War II. Not that it should be that exciting to get to World War II, because, but you know what I mean? We're moving along. So 1933 to 1945. Alright, so, he looks a little not well. Okay, here we go.
Like the First World War, the Second World War for America was a total war. No sooner did war break out in 1941 than Congress passed the War Powers Act, giving the President and Congress extraordinary powers to regulate the economy on behalf of the war effort. At the same time, some 16 million men were drafted into the military service. The social changes generated by the war were profound. Not only did millions of American women suddenly go into the workforce or into the military, at the same time, minority groups such as African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans played important roles in the war effort. African American units fought courageously throughout the war, as did Native Americans, who served a key role as code talkers, talking in their Native American languages so that the enemy could not decipher what was being said. Latinos benefited in the sense that they were readily encouraged to move from Mexico into the southwestern American states in order to work in military-related plants and farms. All of this served to transform the nature of American society at the same time that Franklin Roosevelt was leading the nation to victory in the Second World War.
Okay, so, there we go. So let's start at the beginning. So, our dictators. So we did that activity last week, so you should be familiar with who's in charge of Italy. So we have 1922, Benito Mussolini. He becomes the leader of Italy and suppresses all political opposition. Germany named Adolf Hitler Chancellor in 1933 and began to rearm in defiance of the Versailles Treaty. Germany also leaves the League of Nations. So one of the first things Hitler does is he comes in and he kind of kills all other political parties. So you only have the Nazi party, and he's elected in. Just keep that in mind. He was chosen. He didn't just fight and take over. But he also decides to go against the Treaty of Versailles because he, thinks that's what's holding him back, which it kind of is. Anyway, so 1934, Hitler begins taking back for Germany what the Treaty of Versailles had taken away. The Saar Basin was returned in 1934 and the Rhineland in 1936. France, being the neighbor of the Rhineland, refused to respond. Italy attempted to establish a colony by force in Ethiopia in 1935 and in 1937. And Italian and German troops saw action in the Spanish Civil War. So the Spanish Civil War was kind of like a testing ground it ended up being for World War II. They tested a lot of new technologies and things during that war. All right. Also in 1937, Japan's aggression in China erupted 2 years before it would in Europe. The next year saw the union of Austria and Germany by threat of force and through an agreement with France and Britain at Munich. So that would be appeasement. Oh no. Hitler retook the Sudetenland. There's appeasement. Finally, after completing a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. And that non-aggression pact, basically, it said that the Soviet Union and Germany would kind of work together and they'd split Poland. Germany goes against that pretty quickly, which is why the Soviet Union joins Great Britain and France. All right, here's our leader here, Hitler. He performs the Nazi salute at a rally. Yeah. Okay. All the green, these are our aggressors. Those are our Axis powers. And all those red arrows, especially around Germany, this is all that Germany was taking. And then down at the bottom is Italy. All right. Okay. So we get to Poland. So arguing that Germany required Lebensraum, or living space, Hitler invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. There just wasn't enough space to live in. Germany's going to go take over another country. Oh, imagine if we did that. With an army of 1.5 million soldiers and thousands of vehicles. The Polish army fell before the full brunt of the German assault. 16 days after Poland was invaded by the Germans from the west, the Soviet Union attacked them from the east. The two nations divided Poland among themselves. FDR immediately declares the United States to be neutral in regard to the war in Europe. He did request that Congress revise the Neutrality Acts to allow the Allies access to U.S. ports. Alright, this is Japan. This is China. Japanese troops enter into Beijing after the clash of the Marco Polo Bridge, July of 1937. So they kind of start off by taking Manchuria, attacking China, etc., etc. Alright. Isolationist feelings in the United States grow more profound after the Nye Committee in the Senate reported their findings that U.S. involvement in the Great War had come about through the role of bankers and munitions makers. Congress passed the Neutrality Acts, which prevented the shipping of key materials to aggressor nations. After Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939, FDR began to understand the magnitude of Hitler's ambitions. He persuaded Congress to modify the Neutrality Acts to allow sales of war materials to nations that paid in cash and shipped their goods back home on their own vessels. Cash and carry. Following the invasion of Poland, the Axis remained quiet until the next spring. Then on April 9th, 1940, Germany launched a lightning strike against Denmark and Norway. By May 21st, they had reached the English Channel, and British forces still on the continent were forced to escape at Dunkirk. By June 14th, France had fallen. Of the Allies in the Great War, only England remained. FDR began sending supplies to Great Britain to keep them in the fight, and a ports for ships deals. Great Britain received 50 destroyers in return for leases on bases in the Caribbean. The first peacetime draft was initiated in September of 1940. We were preparing for war. I don't think that anybody thought we could stay out of it, but we wanted to try very hard. This is an aerial photograph of London set aflame by a German bombing raid in 1940. Winston Churchill's response, "We shall never surrender." FDR was the first president to seek and win a third time as president. The Republicans ran Wendell Willkie, who was very similar to FDR's own views. FDR wins by 5 million votes in an electoral landslide. Avoiding complications with laws forbidding loans to nations who had defaulted, FDR would initiate the Lend-Lease program, where he was given the right to give away any war material he believed necessary to the defense of the United States. By June of 1941, Hitler controlled most of Europe, and then he turns on the Soviet Union. He attacks the Soviet Union. So it does take a little bit of time, not a lot, but a little bit, for them to finally attack the Soviet Union. Hitler's very, very greedy. So that's how you wonder, they make this agreement and how they end up with us. So there we go. All right. By this point, Japanese invasion of China had bogged down. It was forced to look elsewhere for the natural resources to fuel its war machine. These items were readily available in where? The Pacific Islands. As Japan becomes more aggressive, FDR would further limit the exporting of American goods to that nation, eventually cutting off oil, scrap, and iron shipments. Japanese leaders realized that in order for their attacks on the Pacific Islands to be successful, the U.S. Pacific Naval Fleet had to be eliminated. After diplomatic meetings to negotiate an end to Japanese involvement in China broke down, the Japanese government approved plans to bomb the U.S. Navy at anchor in Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes bombed 8 U.S. battleships, destroying 3 and damaging the others. In total, 19 ships were sunk or disabled. More than 2,400 people were killed and over 1,700 were wounded. At the same time the Japanese were bombing Pearl Harbor, other fleets were seizing key American holdings in the eastern Pacific Ocean. The next day, FDR asked for a declaration of war and received it. On December 11th, Italy and Germany declared war on the United States. So there you go. Just because we're allies with Japan, that's why. Liars. Alright, the explosion of the USS Shaw. The destroyer exploded after being hit by Japanese warplanes at Pearl Harbor. The Shaw was repaired shortly thereafter and went on to earn 11 battle stars in the Pacific Campaign. Yeah. Alright. Sorry. It's early. This is going to be Japanese expansion before the attack on Pearl Harbor. So you can see they were already working their way through. Oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Excuse me. Pardon me. They're already working their way through Asia. So, alright. So the bombing of Pearl Harbor ended any debate over intervention. By the time the war ended, 16 million men and women were in the military. Due to FDR's foresight, the economy had already begun to gear up for war production through the Lend-Lease plan. The creation of the War Production Board allowed for a centralized control of the nation's conversion from industrial to war production. Instead of raising taxes to finance the war, Congress forced FDR to sell bonds to raise funds. By this point, the economy had gone from one in which people could not find jobs to one in which there were not enough workers to meet the demand. Congress authorized the Office of Price Administration in 1942 to set limits on price to prevent inflation and price gouging. Businesses and workers did not like these limits, but whenever a group went out on strike, the government took control of their companies and sent them back to work. Although FDR had won by a landslide in 1940, the 1942 election pushed Congress toward control by the Republicans. Now Congress would abolish most of the New Deal programs. So, the old story. Republicans versus Democrats. Alright. 1942 poster features a caricature of Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and Hideki Tojo. So you can see them. Set them on their axes. Let's go, everybody. Keep on firing. So this is going to be, join the war efforts. Alright, the expansion of the defense industry after 1940 opened up new incentives for workers to move west. Populations of the newer states of the Union would skyrocket during this era. With millions of men enlisting in the military, women found themselves open to opportunities that previously had been closed. Women became tool makers, lumberjacks, blacksmiths, and so on. Alright. African American leaders during this time fought for civil rights and were emboldened by the job opportunities the war created in the North. During the war, millions of African Americans left the South for these jobs. So very similar to the Great Migration that happens in the earlier 1900s, but more people are leaving the South. Although they were enlisted, black soldiers were kept in segregated facilities from their white counterparts. Separate accommodations were kept for training them as well, such as flight school at Tuskegee, Alabama. So with the Tuskegee Airmen, basically, they were told, well, African American men cannot fly as well as white men. And so they said, you want to bet? And they had their own unit called the Tuskegee Airmen coming out of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which, remember, was founded by who? Yes, Booker T. Washington. Anyway, so they went in and they were equal to or better than their white counterparts in many occasions. So, all right, although racial violence did erupt during this time, it did not reach the extent of the incidents that occurred during World War I. Tuskegee Airmen, 1942, one of the last segregated military training schools. The flight school at Tuskegee trained African American men for air combat during Second World War. Alright. The Double V campaign. So this is an attempt by civil rights leaders to promote democracy at home as well as abroad. So basically victory in the war, victory over rights at home. In order to meet the wartime demands for their crops, Southern farmers began to recruit Hispanic workers from Mexico at harvest time. The growth of Mexican Americans in Los Angeles promoted a week-long riot known as the Zoot Suit Riot after the popular suits of the time. Basically, a young man gets into a scuffle with a young Mexican American kid in a zoot suit gets in a scuffle with a Navy guy. Next thing you know, all people wearing zoot suits are being attacked by whites, and it takes eventually having to remove the Navy from port to stop it. Alright, Native Americans supported the war effort more than any other ethnic group in the United States. Almost 1/3 of all eligible Native Americans served in the armed forces. Due to their distinct and native languages, they were integrated from the start into every military branch to serve as code talkers. They were largely Navajo Indians, which was a spoken language, not a written language. So that helped too. No enemy was able to decipher their native languages. Say, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, opposition to the war was almost non-existent, and as a result, civil liberty abuses were fewer in number. As opposed to the last war, German Americans and Italian Americans did not face the stigma they had previously. However, the same could not be said for Japanese Americans. Over 100,000 of them were forced from their homes and businesses to relocate to camps. This was done to prevent spies from getting information and also protect them from the anti-Japanese hysteria that ran rampant after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Or so they say. They are Navajo code talkers. Japanese never able to break this code. This is during the Battle of Bougainville in 1943. American troops escorted Japanese Americans by gunpoint to remote internment camps. Keep them safe. Yeah, no. Japanese internment, pretty dismal time in our history, I would say. Basically, they took these people away from their homes. They could only take what they could carry, essentially. They were told where they were going. They were brought to places in the middle of the country. One of the camps, and I can't remember the name of it right now, was up North Midwest area. In freezing temperatures below zero often. They don't have proper things to keep them warm because they come from California. That kind of stuff. Now, the big difference here between what we did and what Hitler did, neither is right, we'll just preface it with that, is that they were allowed freedom of movement within the camp. They were allowed to have dances and parties and things like that. They were allowed to grow gardens if they so chose, and whatnot. So, you know, they were captive. They were not allowed to leave, but they were not kept in a room or made to work or anything like that. They just they had jobs and stuff like that. But anyway, moving on. All right. When the United States enters World War II, top priority is given to attacking Hitler and aiding the Allies in Europe. Once done, the Allies turned their full attention to Japan. The signing of the Atlantic Charter in 1942 established a joint war effort that would only end with a joint peace with the Axis powers. No separate peace treaties were allowed. The first American forces battled the Axis in North Africa, where over 200,000 Germans and Italians surrendered in May of 1943. At a meeting at Casablanca, Winston Churchill and FDR agreed that the only unconditional surrender of the Axis power would end the war. World War II in Europe and Africa. It should be just Africa. I'll have to change that. Alright, thanks to the radar and the breaking of Germany's submarine communication code, none of the troop ships crossing the Atlantic were lost. From Africa, the Allies next advanced the island of Sicily, then invaded Italy. Mussolini would be removed from power and Rome was captured on June 4th, 1944. And we all know from our work last week that Mussolini was a chicken and he ran off and his own people killed him. Yep. Alright, Patton commanded the U.S. invasion of Sicily, the largest amphibious action in the war up to that point. He believed the war brings out all the best in his men. Alright, at a meeting in Tehran, Iran, FDR, Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, these are going to be your big three, agreed that all three would continue to fight until Japan was defeated. The bombing of Germany was a constant event. Americans bombed during the day when the missions had a greater accuracy but were more dangerous. The British bombed at night when it was safer. This was not thought of as British failing to pull their own weight, but as a right earned since they had been involved from the start. Hitler had concentrated his forces on the areas most likely to be used for an invasion attempt from England. It was up to the Allied forces under Dwight D. Eisenhower to defeat this Atlantic Wall in order to invade France. On June 6, 1944, D-Day began. Over 5,300 vessels carried 370,000 soldiers across the English Channel. After 2 weeks, 1 million troops had landed in France, and on August 25th, Paris was liberated. The advances in Europe by the Allied forces resulted in a shortage of gasoline. Eisenhower chose to slow down the advance and wait until supplies had caught up with demand before beginning another push toward Germany. Okay, it's our friend and future president here, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's instructing paratroopers before they boarded their airplanes to launch the D-Day assault. All right, this is D-Day, June 6th, 1944. Before they could huddle under a seawall and begin to root out the region's Nazis defenders, soldiers on the Omaha beach had to cross a 50-yard stretch that exposed them to bullets fired from machine guns housed in concrete bunkers. Very dangerous. All right. So, the Republicans nominate Thomas Dewey. FDR easily wins his party's nomination, and he wins the presidency for a fourth time. During this election, they actually had changed his VP to Truman, who had kind of made a name for himself with the, I think the War Production Board. I can't remember, one of the war offices. That's how he came to be known. I will say there's also the fact that FDR was not so great in health, and I think they preferred him to be a replacement for the president if something came in than the previous vice president. All right. At the Battle of the Bulge, December 16th, 1944, Germans forces counterattacked in a last-chance strike to drive the Allies into the sea. Once defeated, the Germans had little but token resistance to offer the Allies as they poured into Germany. All right, at the Yalta Conference in 1945, this happens in February of 1945, the Big Three, FDR, Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, met again to discuss the shape of the post-war world. Also, they would address the need for the creation of a new world security organization, which would become the United Nations, to replace the defunct League of Nations. Although many blame the Yalta Conference for recognizing Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, at the time Soviet forces already controlled those areas and only another war would have driven them out. Our Big Three right here. And you can see, like I said, this is 2 months before FDR dies, or a month and a half before he dies. You can see he's not super well. It's definitely not sitting next to chubby Churchill there. Alright. As we know, FDR does not live to see the end of World War II. He dies on April 12, 1945. Hitler's Germany would collapse less than a month later. Allied forces from the east would meet with the Soviet forces from the west on April 25th. And Mussolini would be killed on April 28th. Hitler committed suicide on April 31st, so we're not talking a month, we're talking 3 weeks. On May 2nd, Berlin fell, and on May 7th, the German army surrendered. So, kind of sad how that happens. Celebration in New York City on VE Day, May 8th, 1945. VE stands for Victory in Europe. Alright, the early part of 1942 is not good for the Allies. Allied possessions in Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and elsewhere fall to Japanese forces. The vital supply line from India to China, the Burma Road, was cut off by the Japanese, and Manila in the Philippines fell, leaving thousands of American soldiers prisoners of war to be beaten and killed on the infamous Bataan Death March. However, a group of B-52s would attack Tokyo in 1942, from the carrier Hornet, assuring the Japanese the United States was not out of the fight. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, American vessels actually took more damage than their enemy. They were able to repulse the Japanese threat to Australia. The next major engagement came at the Battle of Midway, where the Japanese lost 4 carriers and America lost 1, plus a destroyer. From that point on, the Japanese Navy would be on the defense for the rest of the war. So last time that Japan attacks. Alright, General Douglas MacArthur was the commander of Allied forces in the Pacific. He was charged with retaking the islands for the assault on Japan. At the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, 8 Japanese troop ships and 10 warships were sunk. From this point, Japan chose not to reinforce any island being attacked. This allows the Allies to attack the islands. To attack an island basically one by one, allow the Japanese forces to stop sending supplies, and then move on to the next one. The first island would be allowed to wither and die while the Allies leaped to another one. So this is called island hopping. Admiral Chester Nimitz took the vital island of Saipan in the Marianas Island chain. Saipan was close enough to Japan that B-29 bombers would be able to reach it without risking fuel shortages. The next stop was to retake the Philippines. The Army landed on October 20th, 1944. Japan, realizing the importance of raw materials there, to its war efforts, launched a 3-pronged naval assault on the U.S. forces there. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, the Japanese lost most of their remaining naval forces and began to use kamikaze attacks. Scary. Alright, so this is a map of island hopping. General Douglas MacArthur right there walking in. Theatrically coming ashore the island of Leyte in the Philippines, October 1944. Theatrically. I love the photographs that they have because it amazes me. Who's taking them? What are they doing? How are they preventing from getting hurt and injured and whatnot? I mean, this seems like a serious portion in the war. But, alright. With the war in Europe over, the battles in Japan take center stage. On February 19th, 1945, Marines invaded Iwo Jima, whose only use was that of an emergency landing strip for crippled planes. After 20,000 casualties and 7,000 deaths, the island fell to the Americans. The horrific loss of life in these battles led the government to look for ways other than manpower to end the war. From the start of the war, Hitler had been working on an atomic bomb. FDR had realized this and insisted the United States had to have it first. By August of 1945, the bomb was ready, and Truman ordered it to be used on Japan, if it did not surrender before August 3rd. On August 6th, the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, obliterating 80,000 lives in an instant. 2 days later, the Soviets finally declared war on Japan. The next day, August 9th, the second atomic bomb was dropped on the port city of Nagasaki, killing 36,000. Finally, Japan surrendered and the war was over. So it takes 2 big bombs. And those are the number of lives that were killed instantly. I don't have a number of how many died after the fact. Okay, so this image shows the wasteland that remained after the atomic bomb Little Boy decimated Hiroshima in 1945. The most horrific war in human history finally came to an end. Over 70 million fought in the war, of which 25 million died. It's a third. More than a third, actually. Civilian deaths numbered greater than 24 million. When the war ended, the American people realized the isolationist ways they had returned to after World War I could not be countenanced again. So, World War II, and oddly enough, no talk on the Holocaust. I hope it's in your book. Anyway, I hope you have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, and I will speak or see you soon.